Hello, and welcome to this Ethical Dilemma in Science, where we're going to look at part 3 of this mini module on patient autonomy, where we're going to focus in on ivermectin and ask the question whether or not ivermectin is going to be an example of a repurposed treatment for COVID-19, or is this potentially a social media snake oil? So, starting out, basing this on current events, taking a look at what's occurred with the COVID-19 pandemic. We're, a little over 2 years into this situation right now with a disease that we haven't characterized before that's having very detrimental effects throughout society, in both causing people to become ill, causing pretty massive death kind of around the world. But because it is a new illness, we haven't defined a possible treatment for that. And so there's been a lot of interest in trying to find effective treatments to either prevent or minimize the effects of COVID-19. And so taking a look at the news, lots of interest in the medication ivermectin. But if we take a look at it, we're seeing a situation over here where we've got individuals, patients going to court in an effort to get approval to receive ivermectin, in some cases getting the treatment with ivermectin within a hospital setting where the hospitals are going to be reluctant to give kind of unproven medications, unapproved medications. Over here, we've got an example of the legislature, politicians getting involved. In this case, passing a bill or proposing a bill at this point, promoting ivermectin as a treatment for COVID-19. And then in the middle, we've got instances where, public figures, in this case, a podcaster, but lots of different public figures that have taken a stand for the use of ivermectin. In this case, an individual that indicated that he was taking ivermectin when he came down with COVID-19 and hopefully recovered from it fairly well. But the question is ivermectin an effective treatment that should be used with limited numbers of options that are available? The flip side of this, we've got all of these proponents for the use of ivermectin. At the other side, we have things like the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, coming out pretty forcefully about why you shouldn't be taking ivermectin to treat or prevent COVID-19. In the midst of this, coming out in August 2021, a CDC health advisory talking about the fact that the prescriptions for ivermectin have dramatically increased in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And associated with this increased use of ivermectin, we're seeing increases in adverse effects associated with it, as well as overdoses with taking this ivermectin, the treatment for something else, but trying to apply it in this situation. Over here, we've got the World Health Organization, a little bit dated now. It's almost a year ago now, but I checked their guidelines on their website earlier today. They're still against the use. They're not recommending ivermectin for the treatment of COVID-19. And they basically have taken a stand that only those individuals that are enrolled in a clinical study to determine whether or not this is going to be an effective treatment should be receiving ivermectin. And so, what is going on? We've got proponents on one side, we've got opponents on the other, taking a look at whether or not we should be using this FDA-approved medication. Ivermectin is approved for other things, but should be approved for the use of the treatment of COVID-19. So what we're looking at is basically this idea that we can do a process called drug repurposing. Now, drug repurposing is also known as drug repositioning or drug reprofiling, but it's basically when a company, a manufacturer of a medication, has something that's been approved, but then goes back and seeks additional approval for the drug to be used in a new way. And so when we're taking a look at what's occurring with COVID-19, lots of different medications that are available, but which of those would have a potential beneficial effect in the treatment of COVID-19? And so, what is going on? If we take a look at this along the top portion of this slide right here, we take a look at the de novo or the kind of original drug discovery and development and approval process. So you can see a period of time of 4, 8, some cases even more than that, 10 years, 10 plus years, where they're basically kind of trying to come up with different biological mechanisms, different chemical kind of compositions, different chemical shapes that have a potential effect in treating some type of disease. Once you've got the basis for these different chemicals, generally the manufacturers are going to produce lots of different variations of that, slightly different chemical compositions, slightly different chemical properties, but then they go and do a series of in vitro studies, in vitro meaning in glass, meaning that in a laboratory setting, you look at the effects of these different chemicals on cells growing in a tissue culture plate, or taking a look at a biochemical pathway in a test tube. And then those things that look interesting, that they have some type of promise by working on cells individually in the laboratory or working on biochemical pathways in a test tube, those are then tested in animals. So we take a look at these experiments that are occurring. My mouse is not working. These experiments that are occurring in vivo. In vivo now means in life. So you test these chemicals on rat models or mouse models or some type of animal model to see if it has this potential to be used as a treatment for a disease. Now, again, for that normal process of drug development, you've got 8 or 10 years to get to the point where you're going to apply to the FDA to conduct a clinical study. And so you put in the paperwork, and then you go into the phase 1 clinical trials where you will work with a small number of individuals that actually don't have the disease. They would be healthy individuals where they get exposed to that chemical, this developed drug or developing drug, and basically say, is this healthy? Is this something that patients can take without any adverse events? Now, if it's shown to be healthy and not healthy, but safe within the phase 1 trials, they start to do kind of more trials within the phase 2 trials, do more individuals. They may start to look at patients that have the disease to see if there appears to be some benefit from the chemical, from this new drug that is being developed. Ultimately getting to the point of phase 3 clinical trials where they've got good safety evidence, they've got good indication that it's going to be an effective drug for a treatment of disease, and then you have to go through and say, actually, it does have an effect, it is beneficial, and the benefits greatly outweigh the risks associated with that treatment. Now, if all of this has occurred and is still promising, then the company at this point, after 10, 15, maybe 20 years of development, as well as some of these time within these clinical trials, they will then apply to the FDA for drug approval, go through the registration process, and then that drug is licensed for a specific use. Now, what happens with drug repurposing? Either with a medication that has been already approved by the Food and Drug Administration, or in some cases, a medication that has been, kind of developed at some point, kind of along this process, but may have been abandoned for some reason. It is a failed drug for the treatment of a specific disease, but it still may have some effectiveness for other things. In this case, effectiveness in treating COVID-19. So instead of having to start over here at the beginning of trying to design chemicals and test them in test tubes and in cells growing in culture, and then growing and exposing rat models or animal models to this and seeing if it's safe within healthy individuals, they can basically start in kind of this point on the process, 10 years plus into this process, and really only test this on human beings, say, okay, we've already shown that it's safe in healthy individuals. Now we're going to see if it's effective for those patients that have the disease, in this case, patients that have COVID-19. And so we can shorten this approval process by going through and showing mainly that this drug now has an effect for the treatment of this new condition, using this existing drug in a new way. Okay, so if we take a look at this, one very glaring example of drug repurposing is what we can see with thalidomide. Now, thalidomide was a drug that was used to prevent vomiting. It was actually used to treat patients with nausea, and it was a very common prescription to women that were pregnant in the late 1950s and early 1960s for the treatment of morning sickness. Now, lots of different individuals that were pregnant had taken this disease, not taken this disease, taken thalidomide, but very quickly it became apparent that there was this very severe outbreak of severe birth defects affecting thousands and thousands of children. And it was tied back to this exposure, this prenatal exposure to thalidomide. So at that point, in this case, we've got a baby here with some of the characteristic symptoms associated with thalidomide exposure. The long bones in the arms and the legs aren't developing, and so they basically have the hands and the feet that are kind of close to the body. They haven't developed the arms and the legs that would be normally present. So thalidomide was pulled from the market because of these very severe birth defects. But then over time, it was looked at, and even though it causes these severe birth defects, it is effective in treating things like leprosy and multiple myeloma. And so you've got this drug that is effective for treating a variety of conditions, but it has very serious risks associated with it. Again, the Food and Drug Administration, your physician, wants to try to maximize the benefits of a medication while minimizing the risks. And so thalidomide actually has been repurposed. It is back on the market for the treatment of leprosy, for the treatment of multiple myelomas. But as you can see by the product container here, it's a big cross out here, no pregnancy. If you take a look at the requirements here, can cause severe birth defects. Make sure you're preventing pregnancy. Taking contraceptions, whether both male and female, associated with that. You can only get 4 weeks of this prescription because to renew the prescription, you have to, again, be tested to make sure that you're not pregnant or not planning to be pregnant because they have these very severe side effects associated with it. So this is safe and effective for the treatment of leprosy, for the treatment of multiple myeloma, but the risks would outweigh those benefits in those individuals of childbearing years and those individuals that might be pregnant. And so in this case, again, that risk-benefit analysis determined that in this case, thalidomide is beneficial in some circumstances, but not in all circumstances. So if we take this and attempt to apply this to our question about COVID-19, we take a look at the drug Remdesivir. Remdesivir was originally a drug that was developed for treating the Ebola virus, and so that would be an antiviral medication for treating RNA-based viruses. So the Ebola outbreak in 2014, lots of interest in trying to come up with antiviral medications. That epidemic, the kind of outbreak of Ebola kind of burned out pretty quickly, and so they kind of dropped the research at that point. They continued a little bit further and were able to show that remdesivir as this antiviral agent would protect against SARS as well as MERS, different variations of respiratory coronaviruses, respiratory illnesses. So they basically stopped working with it when those outbreaks ended, but they still had that available. So that when SARS-CoV-2, the virus behind the COVID-19 pandemic, emerged in late 2019, going into 2020, the company that developed remdesivir started testing it on patients to determine whether or not it was going to be effective for the treatment of COVID-19. So they started in, again, phase 2, phase 3 clinical trials really quickly. They were able by, I think this was October of 2020, have some pretty good data showing the effectiveness of remdesivir in preventing kind of progression of the disease, preventing kind of some of the severe effects that we would see in patients with COVID-19. And then based on those studies, the Food and Drug Administration in mid-October of 2020 approved remdesivir for the treatment of COVID-19. Now, like we saw with the initial approval of the vaccines for the virus, the FDA gave this emergency use authorization, basically saying that it appears to have good benefits, it appears to have kind of minimal risks, but we're not giving full approval until we have more information. And so it is still available. In this case, we can take a look at Remdesivir in the injection here. And if you take a look real closely at this, it actually says on the label, for use under emergency use authorization. And so this drug is then available, but it still needs to be tested. It still needs to be kind of approved completely in order to be able to be used beyond this period of COVID-19 pandemic and within the realm of this emergency use authorization. So it was able to kind of roll out within a very short period of time. October, 10th month, less than a year after the emergence of COVID-19, we had the first possible medication associated with it. Again, using this emergency use authorization process to take a drug that had been in the process of development and apply it for a specific usage, in this case, the treatment of COVID-19 patients. Now, there's still promise associated with it. It's still approved for treatment of categories of COVID-19 patients, but there's some limitations associated with it. It's an expensive drug. It has to be infused intravenously, and so it's a process that takes an hour or two for a treatment. You need to have 3 treatments in a row, so you basically have to go there for 3 consecutive days for a period of time. And so, some restrictions or limitations then on the ease at which this is going to become available and used by patients. Now, the second way we can take a look at existing medications for the treatment of new diseases, or at least new applications, is this concept of off-label prescribing. Now, with off-label prescribing, what we're looking at is taking, again, an FDA-approved medication, a medication that's been approved effective for something else, and then applying it to a new usage. And so off-label prescribing provides leeway, provides discretion to your physician in order to be able to work with you individually to come up with an individualized treatment plan for your specific condition, for your specific circumstances that you're under. And so if we take a look at this on this slide, and this is a little bit an older slide, I think this is a 2008 study, taking a look at the estimated number of prescriptions related to different categories of medication. Now, the darker blue on this is going to be on-label use, so this would be use of the prescription for what it's been FDA approved for, and then this lighter brown bar here is going to be an off-label use. And so in that situation, the physician working with the patient has determined that it has a high likelihood of being beneficial to the patient with minimal risk associated with it. And so we can see the application of these different medications for the treatment of things that haven't been tested and approved by the Food and Drug Administration. Now, in this case, psychiatric therapies here, about 2 out of 3 usage, at least within this period of time in 2001. The blue, again, on-label use, about twice as much as the off-label use. But still, about a third of the psychiatric therapies are being used off-label. When you run the statistics a little bit further, it's estimated that about 1 out of 5 prescriptions is for a medication that has an off-label use. And so if we take a look at this, again, this idea is that you've got this drug that has been approved in some way. You've got an approved product dossier, the way they're describing it here, where it is approved, it is marketed, it is available for a patient to get it with a doctor's approval. Now, what we can see, again, off-label medications, good example of which would be cancer medications. Cancer treatments are approved normally for a specific type of cancer, for a specific type of cell, but it is probably going to be effective for related forms of cancer. And so in some cases, the company will go back and get approval through that repurposing or repositioning or reprofiling to get FDA approval for that. But more often than not, what we can see is that many companies will just kind of accept that their medication is going to be used off-label, that it's going to be used by doctors with information that doctors share with one another about the effectiveness of this drug in the treatment of something that is not approved for, a treatment that is different from what it was developed for. Now, keep in mind that the Food and Drug Administration is focused on providing safe medications for individuals and ensuring that individuals are not subject to kind of unjustified claims, unsupported claims. Getting to that idea of snake oil. And so a company can't advertise their off-label usage. If they do that, they'll actually get fined by the Food and Drug Administration. Still, many companies are not going to go through the process of a repurposing during the reapproval, basically submitting a supplemental new drug application here to get it approved for a different usage. Again, with this, many times we see physicians working with materials off-label, for a different disease. We're talking about cancer, a different type of cancer. In some cases, different medication dosages, different durations of the treatment, different things like that. So it's entirely possible that a physician working with a patient on an individual case-by-case basis is going to prescribe something off-label because the doctor feels that it's going to be beneficial to the patient. This runs into a little bit of difficulty where many times a prescription needs to be approved in order to be paid for by a prescription plan, by your health insurance plan. And if it's being used off-label, sometimes the prescription or the insurance company is not going to be covering that. And so that is kind of a limitation to this idea of using materials off-label. Now, from this, it kind of gets to that question of what is this difference between clinical research and medical treatment? If a doctor can go through, work with a patient and say, okay, I think you need to take this, or think you need to take that, they can go through and make a decision to use something that is kind of beyond what the FDA has approved that medication for. Does that become research, or is that still medical treatment? And so kind of taking a look at this. Taking a look at what's going on with clinical research. And again, clinical research is providing the high quality of evidence that we would need in order to be able to determine whether or not this medication is safe and effective for use by a number of individuals. And so in clinical research, your efforts are going to be made to use a systematic process, to use a well-defined process, usually involving a large number of volunteer subjects, to try to understand the information necessary to determine, is this a safe and effective treatment in order to help future patients? And so what you're going to do, if you're involved in a clinical research study, is you're going to do a standardized experimental design. You're going to do things in exactly the same way so that you're able to compare the results. And in many cases, doing clinical research is going to involve, working with products, working with chemicals, working with medications that have been unproven specifically for the use that you're looking at. Now, when those studies are done, their results are going to be published in medical journals so that that information is available to clinicians, it's available to other researchers, and potentially it's available to the FDA for determining whether or not this drug should be approved for this new use. Now, the flip side of that is going to be medical treatment. In the case of medical treatment, this is really an individual decision between a physician and their specific patient. And so the physician will sit down with the patient and try to come up with an individualized treatment plan to specifically meet the needs of that patient. And so what you're going to have is within that individual treatment plan is basically kind of an application of a medication that's already been shown to be safe and effective for something else, and the doctor feels it's going to be effective for the treatment of this specific condition that the patient has. Now, while clinical research can be thought about as being generalizable, it's being available in a more public way to the research and the science and the medical communities, it's published in a medical journal, where if a physician is treating an individual patient, that information remains private. That information is going to be recorded within their individual medical records, and really is not going to influence whether or not a drug is going to be approved by the Food and Drug Administration. There's really no mechanism for getting from these individual medical treatment plans to kind of a broader kind of research perspective. Now, if we get back to this question about ivermectin, what is the issue? Again, taking a look at the fact that in late 2019, early 2020, we had a new disease emerge, COVID-19. No clear indication on what is going to be effective for treating that disease. Relatively scary at the onset because it has some very severe symptoms, respiratory symptoms. A large number of individuals would get kind of a mild illness, but somewhat randomly, and we're still doing research on trying to determine why it affects some individuals more than it affects other individuals. Some individuals were getting very, very sick, having long-term detrimental effects associated with COVID-19, including a large number of individuals that have died. Over 600,000 Americans have died, and I think over 6 million people worldwide have died of COVID-19 in the short 2 years that it's been out. So what happened is researchers would do what they need to do. They would say, okay, we've got this new disease out there. We don't have 20 years to come up with a new treatment, to develop a drug de novo, to design a drug and get it through all of the processes, the test tube work in the lab in vitro, the animal work in the lab in vivo, and then starting these clinical studies. So what they're going to do is take a look at repurposing existing medications. And so what scientists would do is go through and try to say, okay, what of our existing approved medications would have the potential to treat this virus? And one of those was ivermectin. Ivermectin is approved for the treatment of parasitic roundworms. It's great for that. It has huge benefits for the treatment of these parasitic infections. And the idea was that maybe this would be effective for the treatment of the COVID-19 virus. So very early on, some initial studies, in this case they're looking at it, they can see that the drug ivermectin inhibited the copying of the virus in vitro, so basically in a laboratory setting. And so that was promising. But there were a lot of chemicals, a lot of drugs that were promising from the beginning. They were used sometimes at a much higher dosage than what we would be able to give safely to an individual, but it seemed to have some type of effectiveness in treating the virus in kind of a laboratory setting. So the next step was to take and then start to test that on individuals. And so as those human clinical trials kind of developed, early on, there were some very early reports that were promising, that appeared to have an effect, that ivermectin was beneficial for the treatment of COVID-19. But over time, as larger studies with more subjects, with more standardization across the different trials and more standardization with the dosages of drugs that we're doing in the medications, the other medications that were being used, the characterization of the patients that got ivermectin versus those that didn't get ivermectin. Basically, there were a lot of studies that came out there that contradicted the early studies. And we see this a lot in research, that we need to do a small pilot study. You get something promising, but then when you do a full-blown larger study, what was promising turns out to be not as promising. And so that's the case with ivermectin, is that we've seen a number of larger studies that have occurred, in this case a large randomized clinical trial, where they've gone through and in a very standardized way tried to determine, is ivermectin an effective treatment for COVID-19? When they do that, when they run the controls, they've got some patients that get ivermectin, some patients that don't get ivermectin, and they take a look at the results with these larger groups of individuals. They're really not seeing that initial effect that they saw very early on. So because of this, and again, the conclusions in this study, I'm going to glance over here so I can see it. In this randomized clinical trial of high-risk patients with mild to moderate COVID-19, ivermectin treatment during early illness did not prevent progression to severe disease. The study findings do not support the use of ivermectin for patients with COVID-19. We're seeing this appearing over and over again as these larger studies are now being published. So again, it's a great drug. Ivermectin is a great drug for treating parasitic roundworm infections, but it's not effective, at least based on the evidence that we have now, for the treatment of COVID-19. So this gives rise to kind of the ethical dilemma, the question kind of related to patient autonomy within this unit. Should patients have access to unproven off-label medications to treat conditions when they have a limited number of options available to them? And again, look at this from multiple perspectives. You have individuals, you have patients that have probably heard via social media, via their friends, their neighbors, their family, that there's this drug that people say is going to be effective. And if you have limited options, you want to go with the best option that's available. And if it appears that this is it, then you're going to want to do it. So how do you balance the desire of these patients that want to get access to this unproven treatment, even though it's not proven, that it may not have an effect, but it's potentially better than nothing? How do you balance that with the physician's need, your doctor's need to maximize your patient benefit? They're going to come up with an individualized treatment plan for you to make you better, to give you the benefits of this treatment while minimizing the risks of harmful interactions. And so, what does a physician consider when determining whether or not they are going to prescribe this off-label use of ivermectin for the treatment of COVID-19? And then finally, we've got the Food and Drug Administration here. The FDA, their role is to protect the public from harmful, unproven agents. They're there to protect people from misleading claims about treatment benefits. And so you can't, make these outlandish claims that we have a miracle drug that will do this unless it truly is a miracle drug that has beneficial effects. So in this case, again, the Food and Drug Administration does not have evidence that's been given to them. There's really not a lot of scientific evidence, experimental evidence, supporting the use of ivermectin, even though we're seeing lots and lots of interest by patients for getting this. And so how should these patients, have access to an unproven off-label medication to treat conditions if they only have limited options available to them? As always, I'll post the references in the links below. Quite a few references for this one because I dug through both the repurposing as well as the off-label usage, and then looked a little bit more detail into what was known about ivermectin very early on versus what evidence is there for ivermectin now. As always, if you have any questions, please reach out to me. As I said, I'll post the information in the links below. Thank you and have a great day.